When he came home, I was gone. The only things I left behind were an envelope, a photograph, and my wedding ring. I know exactly how that evening looked, because I have replayed it in my mind more times than I care to admit. Ethan's key in the door, the particular scrape it made against the lock, the one I used to tease him about fixing for 3 years running. He would have called out my name first, the way he always did, expecting the smell of dinner and the sound of the television droning through the living room. Instead, there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the settling creak of a house that had, for the first time in 11 years, stopped waiting for me. I imagine him standing in the doorway, a moment too long, coat still on, keys still in his hand, waiting for the ordinary sounds of his life to catch up with him. They never did. I know Ethan. He would have told himself I was running late from base, that I'd forgotten to text, that there was some perfectly reasonable explanation waiting to present itself. That was always his way. Assume the world would rearrange itself around his comfort, before considering that he might be the reason it hadn't. He would have gone to the kitchen first. That's where I left the envelope propped against the sugar bowl we'd bought on our honeymoon in Savannah, back when I still believed a marriage was something you built together instead of something one person carried alone. Beside it, my wedding ring catching the light from the window, and beneath both, face down, a photograph. I chose that photograph carefully. It was the one from the day before I shipped out for my first deployment, Ethan holding Lily on his hip, both of them squinting into the sun, and me standing slightly apart, already half a soldier in my posture, even in civilian clothes. On the back I had written just one line, "Keep this." It was the last day we were truly a family. I did not write him a long letter. I have never believed that the people who hurt you deserve your explanations, only your exit. So, the note was short, almost clinical, the kind of message you'd leave for a coworker rather than a husband of over a decade. Don't look for me. One day you'll understand why. No accusation, no cruelty, just a door closing quietly enough that he wouldn't hear it until much later, when the silence became too loud to ignore. I know he called my cell phone first, probably standing in the same spot, the photograph still in his hand. I had turned it off hours earlier and left it in a drawer at my sister's house in Charlotte, 300 miles from anything familiar. I picture him pacing, then jaw tight, telling himself I was being dramatic, that I was punishing him for some argument he couldn't even properly recall, because in his mind there had been no single argument big enough to justify a woman disappearing. That has always been Ethan's particular talent, the ability to misplace the truth so completely that his own conscience never had to carry it. By the next morning, the story would have started falling apart in his hands. A call to the bank, and the discovery that I had already moved everything under my name into a separate account weeks before. A call to the dealership confirming that yes, Mrs. Porter had come in on Tuesday and signed over her car. A call to my unit where Colonel Hayes would have told him in that flat, unbothered military tone that Major Porter was on approved leave and unreachable for the foreseeable future. I had not run away in a fit of anger. I had executed an exit the way I had been trained to execute every mission in my career, quietly, thoroughly, and with every contingency already accounted for. There would be no dramatic confrontation for Ethan to win with his charm, no shouting match he could later recast as evidence of my instability. Just an absence total and deliberate, and a silence he would have to sit inside for as long as it took him to understand what he had actually lost. I think about him standing in that kitchen a lot in the years since. Not with satisfaction, I want to be honest about that, because this was never a story I enjoyed living. But there was a kind of peace in knowing that, for the first time since I'd married him, I was the one who got to decide when the conversation was over. He would have gone to bed that night, still certain I'd walk back through the door within a week, humbled, apologetic, ready to resume the life he had built around his own comfort. That certainty was the last thing I ever gave him, and even that he had taken for himself. I did not know that first night in Charlotte, staring at the ceiling of my sister's guest room with my daughter asleep down the hall, that it would be 10 years before Ethan Porter and I stood in the same room again. I only knew that I could no longer live inside a marriage built on a lie I had been carrying alone. Whatever came next, I would build it standing up in my own name on my own terms. I had no way of knowing then just how far that road would take me, or how far it would take him in the opposite direction. I need to go back further than that night in the kitchen, because the truth is, my leaving didn't begin the evening I walked out. It began almost 3 years earlier in small pieces I collected without even meaning, to the way you notice a crack in a foundation long before the house actually shifts. I found out about Vanessa Cole by accident. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories usually go: the wife who suspects who snoops, who builds a case out of jealousy and calls it proof. That was never me. I came home early one Thursday after a training exercise got canceled, and I found an earring on the guest room floor that wasn't mine. Small gold, shaped like a leaf. I stood there holding it for a long time, turning it over in my palm, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold, the way it does right before you have to make a decision you already know you're going to make. I didn't confront him that night. I have never been someone who acts on the first wave of feeling. The army trained that impulse out of me a long time ago, taught me instead to gather information before I moved. So, I watched. I noticed the new cologne, the phone he started angling away from me at dinner, the business trips that got longer and less specific. And eventually I noticed her Vanessa, a colleague from his architecture firm 12 years younger, with the kind of easy laugh that made people forget to ask hard questions. It went on for over 3 years. I know that now with certainty, though. I suspect at the time I only let myself confirm what I already understood in my body. He brought her to our house more than once, I later learned, on days he knew I'd be at the base for a full shift. Our house, the one with Lily's height marks penciled into the kitchen doorframe. But the affair, as much as it broke something in me, was not actually the thing that made me leave. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a story like this to hinge on betrayal of the body when really it was betrayal of everything else that finished it. I discovered going through our joint accounts one evening, while Ethan was supposedly working late, that money had been moving in patterns I didn't recognize. Small at first, then larger. I traced it back over several months and found that he had been quietly draining a savings account we had opened for Lily's college fund the year she was born. Nearly $40,000 gone in increments small enough that I might never have noticed if I hadn't already been looking for reasons not to trust him. I found the paper trail, eventually a down payment on a condominium 2 towns over, the deed listed under Vanessa's name, the funds routed through an account Ethan had opened without my knowledge. I remember sitting at our dining room table with the bank statement spread out in front of me like a crime scene, and thinking with a kind of terrible clarity that this man had taken something from his own daughter to build a life with another woman. That was the moment something in me went quiet in a different way, not shattered but resolved. Still, I said nothing. I told myself I was protecting Lily from more instability while I figured out my next move, and maybe that was true. But if I'm honest, some part of me was also protecting myself, trying to hold on to the last thread of a life I had built my whole identity around, even as I could feel it disintegrating in my hands. The final piece came on a Tuesday evening in March. I had come home 2 days early from a training rotation in Georgia, wanting to surprise Lily before her school recital. Instead, I stood in our own hallway and heard Ethan's voice through the cracked door of his study, low and warm in the particular register he used to reserve for me. "Cassidy only knows how to wear a uniform," he said, and I could hear the smile in it, the ease of a man who believed no one was listening. "She stopped being my wife years ago." I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough to hear Vanessa laugh softly in response, long enough to feel 11 years of my life rearrange themselves into a shape I no longer recognized. I did not open the door. I did not scream or cry or demand an explanation. I simply turned, walked back out to my car, and sat in the driveway until my hands stopped shaking enough to drive. That night, I made a decision that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with dignity. I would not fight Ethan Porter in the way he expected, not with accusations shouted across a kitchen, not with a messy public unraveling that would leave Lily standing in the wreckage of 2 parents at war. I have seen what that kind of divorce does to children in my own family and in the families of soldiers I served with. I refused to hand my daughter that inheritance. So instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer 3 counties away, someone with no connection to Ethan's firm or our social circle. I began quietly and methodically gathering the documents I would need, not to destroy him, though I could have, but simply to protect what was mine, And more importantly, what was Lily's? I moved money, I made calls, I built an exit the way I had built every operation in my career, with patience, with precision, and with absolutely no warning given to the other side. Ethan never knew any of this was happening beneath the surface of our ordinary evenings, our ordinary dinners, our ordinary goodnight kisses. He believed right up until the night he came home to an empty house that our marriage was simply continuing on as it always had. He had no idea that I had already left him in every way that mattered months before I ever walked out the door. The years that followed my leaving were for Ethan a slow unraveling of everything he thought he'd secured for himself. I learned most of this later in fragments from Lily, from mutual acquaintances, from the particular kind of gossip that travels through a small professional community whether you invite it or not. I want to tell it plainly without satisfaction because that was never the point. The divorce itself was almost anticlimactic. I filed quietly through the lawyer 3 counties over, and I asked for remarkably little. No portion of the house, no alimony, no division of his retirement accounts, though I would have been entitled to a share after 11 years of marriage. I wanted exactly one thing, and I made that clear from the very first meeting: primary custody of Lily, then 8 years old, with a custody arrangement that would allow her a stable, uncomplicated relationship with her father if he chose to maintain one. Ethan agreed to nearly everything without a fight, and for a long time I didn't understand why, until Lily told me years later what she remembered of that period. Vanessa had already moved into the picture in earnest by then, and Ethan in his mind was building a fresh start. A child, even his own child, felt to him like an obligation that might slow down the momentum of that new life. I have never repeated that thought to Lily in those exact words. She figured it out on her own eventually, the way children always do. Vanessa moved into our old house within 4 months of the divorce being finalized. They married the following spring, a small ceremony that I heard about through a cousin of Ethan's, who still sent me a Christmas card every year out of some lingering loyalty. I felt nothing when I heard the news except a distant clinical curiosity about how long it would last. Not very long, as it turned out. Whatever had drawn Vanessa to Ethan during the affair, the excitement of something forbidden perhaps, or the flattery of being chosen over a wife, didn't survive very well once it became ordinary. Within 2 years, friends were mentioning arguments overheard through open windows spending that outpaced what Ethan's firm was bringing in, a pattern of infidelity that I gathered ran in more than one direction once the initial passion cooled. By the 4th year, Vanessa was gone too, taking with her a settlement that ate significantly into what remained of Ethan's savings. I did not seek this information out. I want to be honest about that. I had built a life that required my full attention elsewhere, and for long stretches of time I genuinely did not think about Ethan Porter at all. But news has a way of finding you, especially in a country where the world feels smaller than people expect. My own path during those years moved in the opposite direction entirely. I threw myself back into my career with the kind of focus that had always come naturally to me, the kind that had once made Ethan complain I cared more about my unit than my own family. I completed 2 additional deployments, both logistics postings that stretched my abilities in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was promoted twice, first to lieutenant colonel and eventually to full colonel, a rank fewer than 1 in 5 officers of my era ever reached. Colonel Hayes, my old commander, became something between a mentor and a friend during those years, the kind of steady presence I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When I finally retired from active duty after 18 years of service, I didn't slow down. I took the discipline and the network I'd built and started a logistics consulting firm, advising private companies and government contractors on supply chain operations. It was slow at first, the way any new venture is, but I had spent 2 decades learning how to manage complexity under pressure, and it turned out that skill translated well into the civilian world. Within 5 years, the firm had grown from just myself and a laptop into a company with 11 employees and contracts across 3 states. Lily grew up mostly in the space I built for her first with my sister in Charlotte, and then once I'd stabilized things in a quiet house of our own outside Richmond. She was a serious, watchful child who became a serious, kind young woman. She excelled in school without my ever having to push her the way children sometimes do when they've had to grow up faster than expected. She went on to college on a partial scholarship, majored in public health, and by the time she graduated, she had a job offer from a hospital administration firm before she even walked across the stage. Through all of it, she and I grew close in a way I hadn't fully anticipated when I made the decision to leave her father. I had worried in the earliest years that she would resent me for the disruption, for the moves, for the absence of the two-parent household her friends seemed to take for granted. Instead, what grew between us was something sturdier than resentment, a kind of mutual respect, built out of watching each other survive difficult things without falling apart. She saw her father a handful of times each year, holidays mostly, sometimes a birthday dinner squeezed in around his schedule. I never spoke badly of him in front of her, not once, not even in the years when I had every justification to. I told her only that people are complicated, that love and disappointment can live in the same person, and that she was allowed to make up her own mind about who her father was without my influence weighing on the scale. What Ethan felt most keenly, I think, in those years of his own unraveling was not the loss of Vanessa, or even the loss of me. It was watching his daughter grow into an adult who called him twice a year out of obligation rather than love, while calling her mother nearly every week just to talk. That absence, more than any of the financial or romantic setbacks, was the one he could never quite explain away to himself. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in late September, and I remember exactly where I was standing when Ethan told me about it later, though. Of course, I received my own copy days before he ever mentioned his. Lily was 28 by then, engaged to a thoughtful young man named Marcus. She'd met during her residency rotation, and the wedding had been 18 months in the planning. I had been involved in nearly every decision from the venue to the seating chart, the way mothers are when their daughters trust them completely. What I hadn't been involved in, and what I only learned about after the fact, was Lily's decision to send her father an invitation of his own. She told me about it over coffee one Sunday morning, watching my face carefully for a reaction I made sure not to give her. "I want him there, Mom," she said. "Not because he's earned it, because I think I need to know I did everything I could to include him, whatever he chooses to do with that." I told her I thought that was a wise and generous decision, and I meant it. I had spent 20 years teaching my daughter that dignity means giving people the chance to rise to an occasion, even when history suggests they won't. I wasn't about to undermine that lesson the one time it mattered most. The card she sent Ethan, she told me later, was simple. No long explanation, no invitation to reconcile, nothing that could be mistaken for an opening he hadn't earned. "Dad, I'd like you to be there," that was all. I found out afterward that Ethan had read those 5 words, perhaps a dozen times before he ever set the card down, turning them over, the way I imagine he once turned over my own note all those years before, searching for a hidden meaning that would let him feel forgiven. I heard through Lily that Ethan had allowed himself to believe this was an opening, not just an invitation to a wedding, but an invitation back into the kind of family he'd once dismissed as beneath his ambitions. I understood that hope, even if I didn't share it. Hope has a way of rewriting the facts of a situation to suit what a person needs to believe. I arrived at the venue that morning with a clarity I'd been cultivating for a decade. This was Lily's day, not a stage for old grievances, and I intended to hold myself to that standard no matter who else was in the room. I helped with her hair. I fastened the small pearl buttons at the back of her gown, my hand steadier than I expected them to be. I told her, looking at her in the mirror, that her father would have been proud of the woman she'd become, and I meant that too, in the strange, layered way you can mean something true about a person you no longer respect. Ethan arrived early, according to the wedding coordinator, standing near the entrance in a gray suit that looked expensive in the way clothes look when a man is trying too hard to prove something to himself. He asked more than once whether I had arrived yet, and each time was told only that the ceremony would begin on schedule. I came in the way I always did those days, on my own terms, in a car I'd hired, rather than one that would require small talk with anyone from Ethan's world. When I stepped out, I know the parking lot went quiet in the particular way a room does when it recognizes someone it wasn't expecting. I had kept a public life in the years since the divorce, speaking occasionally at logistics conferences, sitting on an advisory board for a veterans nonprofit, appearing now and then in the kind of business press that covers women who built companies from nothing. Some of Ethan's old colleagues, it turned out, had crossed paths with my professional life without ever connecting it to the wife he used to describe, when he described me at all as someone who'd simply disappeared. I did not look for Ethan when I walked in. I found my seat in the front row beside my sister, and I focused my attention entirely on the aisle where my daughter would soon appear. I felt him before I saw him, that particular awareness you carry of someone who once shared your whole life, even after a decade of separation. When I turned briefly, he was already looking at me, and for just a moment the confident architect I remembered was gone, entirely replaced by someone smaller, older, and visibly unsteady in a way I hadn't anticipated. His hair had gone gray at the temples. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, the kind that come less from age than from disappointment accumulated over years. He looked more than anything like a man who had spent a decade waiting for a conversation he'd never quite worked up the courage to start. I gave him a small, polite nod, the kind you'd offer a distant acquaintance, and turned back toward the aisle. I heard faintly my sister exhale beside me, and I understood she'd been holding her breath on my behalf, waiting to see whether 10 years apart had left any wound still raw enough to bleed in public. It hadn't. That was the strange, quiet gift of everything I'd built in the years since I walked out of that house. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of enough peace that his face no longer had the power to unsettle me. The music began. Lily appeared at the end of the aisle in the dress we'd chosen together, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with either of her parents, and everything to do with the life she'd built for herself. I watched her walk toward her future, and for the first time in 10 years I allowed myself to think of Ethan Porter not as a wound I'd survived, but simply as a man standing somewhere behind me, watching a life unfold that he had played only the smallest part in shaping. The reception took place in a converted barn just outside Richmond. String lights, woven through the rafters, the kind of setting Lily had always pictured since she was a teenager, cutting pictures out of bridal magazines at our kitchen table. I remember thinking, watching her move through the room in that dress, how strange it was that a single evening could hold so many separate versions of our family's history at once. Ethan approached me during the cocktail hour while Lily was occupied taking photographs with Marcus's family. I saw him coming and made the decision in the space of a few seconds not to walk away. Running from him would have suggested he still had power over me, and that was no longer true. "Cassidy," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't expected. Not the practiced charm I remembered, but something rawer, less rehearsed. "You look well. Really well." "Thank you," I said. "Congratulations on the day. Lily's worked hard for this. I'd love to talk, if you'd be willing, just for a few minutes." I told him as gently as I could manage that we were here for our daughter, and that whatever conversation he wanted to have could wait for another time, if it needed to happen at all. He nodded, something flickering across his face that might have been disappointment or might have been relief at being let off the hook, and he stepped back into the crowd. I hadn't fully appreciated until that evening how much my life had grown in directions Ethan knew nothing about. Throughout the reception, I found myself greeted by people whose presence clearly startled him. A retired 2-star general who'd served on an advisory panel with me, a state senator I'd worked alongside on a veterans employment initiative, a business owner whose supply chain my firm had rebuilt after a near-catastrophic failure 2 years earlier. Each of them greeted me with the easy familiarity of people who respected what I'd built, and each conversation seemed to land on Ethan like a small accumulating weight. I watched him from across the room more than once, standing slightly apart from these exchanges, his expression somewhere between confusion and a dawning uncomfortable recognition. I imagine it was the first time he understood in any real way that the life I'd built after leaving him was not a consolation prize. It was simply a life full and complete that had never needed his presence to flourish. The moment that changed the shape of the evening came during the toasts. Lily had prepared a slideshow, something Marcus's sister had helped her put together, meant to celebrate the journey that had brought her to this day. I hadn't seen the final version in advance, and I don't think Ethan had either. The images moved chronologically at first: Lily as a baby, as a toddler, the ordinary chronicle of a childhood. Then, without warning, a photograph appeared that made my chest tighten. It was the picture from the day before my first deployment, the one I had left behind on the kitchen table all those years ago. Ethan holding Lily on his hip, both of them squinting into the sun, and me standing slightly apart in my careful, upright posture. I hadn't known Lily still had a copy. I found out later she'd found it among Ethan's things during one of her rare visits years earlier, and had quietly kept it without telling either of us. The room went still in the particular way a crowd does when it senses something important is about to be said. Lily stepped up to the microphone, Marcus's hand steady at the small of her back, and she looked first at me, then deliberately at her father. "I want to say something about my parents." She began, her voice even clearly rehearsed, but no less sincere for that. "Growing up, I could have been taught to hate my father. I want you all to know that my mother never once asked me to. She never said a cruel word about him, not when I was 8, not when I was 18, not ever. She let me draw my own conclusions about who he was, even when I know now that she had every reason not to." I felt Ethan's eyes on me from across the room, though I kept my own gaze fixed on my daughter. "My mom taught me something else instead," Lily continued. "She taught me that dignity isn't about what someone else does to you. It's about who you decide to become in spite of it. She built an entire life out of that lesson, and somewhere along the way, without either of us really noticing, she taught me to build mine the same way." She paused, and I watched her throat work as she swallowed whatever emotion she was managing to hold steady. "Mom never told me to hate Dad. She only taught me to respect myself." The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory kind. It rippled through the barn with a weight that made several people around me wipe at their eyes, and I understood, watching Ethan's face crumple slightly before he recovered his composure, that something had shifted permanently in that room. Whatever image he had carried of himself as a man who'd simply drifted into a difficult divorce, his daughter had just gently and without cruelty dismantled it in front of everyone who mattered to her. I did not gloat. I want to be honest about that, because it would have been easy in that moment to feel something like triumph. Instead, what I felt was a quiet, aching pride in the woman my daughter had become, and a strange, unexpected pity for the man standing across the room who was only now, a decade too late, beginning to understand everything he had actually lost. Later that night, as the reception wound down and guests began drifting toward the exit, Ethan found me again near the coat check, his expression stripped of the polish he usually wore so easily. "I didn't know she felt that way," he said quietly. "I didn't know any of it." "You know now," I told him, and for the first time all evening, I let something soften in my own voice. Not forgiveness exactly, but an acknowledgement that the man in front of me was finally, however belatedly, looking at himself clearly. We spoke again 3 days after the wedding, though the meeting hadn't been my idea. Ethan called Lily first, asking if she thought I would be willing to see him, and Lily, to her credit, told him only that she would pass along the message and let me decide for myself. I thought about it for a full day before agreeing. Not because I felt any obligation toward Ethan, but because I had carried something for 10 years that I'd never quite finished delivering, and some part of me recognized that his willingness to ask finally meant the moment had arrived to close that particular chapter properly. We met at a coffee shop near my office neutral ground, the kind of quiet mid-morning hour when the tables around us were mostly empty. He looked smaller in that setting than he had at the wedding, stripped of the crowd that had made him seem briefly like a man still trying to hold on to some remnant of stature. "Thank you for coming," he said, wrapping both hands around his cup without drinking from it. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and set a second envelope on the table between us, plain unmarked, the twin of the one I'd left on our kitchen counter a decade earlier. "I think it's time you read the rest of this," I told him. He looked at it for a long moment before opening it, and I watched something uncertain pass across his face, the particular hesitation of a man who suspects he's finally about to be told something he can't undo hearing. Inside was a copy of the original note I'd left him, the short, unadorned lines he'd read 1,000 times over the years, trying to extract meaning from their brevity. But behind it was a second page, one he had never seen, one I had written that same night, and simply never included because at the time I hadn't trusted myself to know whether I would ever want him to read it. I watched him read it slowly, his eyes moving over each line. If you're reading this, it means you finally wanted the whole truth. I know about Vanessa. I have known for 3 years. I know about the money you took from Lily's account. And I know what you said about me in your study the night before I decided to leave. I could have destroyed you. I had everything I needed, the financial records, witnesses, enough to end your career and your reputation both. I chose not to, not because I forgave you, but because Lily deserved a father, even an imperfect one, and I refused to let my own anger cost her that. What I hope more than anything is that someday you become a man worthy of the daughter we made together. If you're reading this now, I suspect you finally understand what that cost me. He set the letter down very carefully, as though it might come apart in his hands, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet in a way I had never once seen in 11 years of marriage. "You could have ruined me," he said quietly. "You had everything." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about that question for a moment, though I had answered it to myself many times over the years. Because destroying you wouldn't have given me anything back. It would have just meant Lily grew up watching 2 parents tear each other apart in public, and she would have carried that the rest of her life, whether or not either of us intended it. I decided a long time ago that I wasn't willing to let your choices become the architecture of her childhood. He put his face in his hands then, and I sat quietly, letting him have that moment, without trying to soften it or rush him through it. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost whatever composure he'd walked in with. "I told myself for years that you left because you were selfish," he said, "because the army meant more to you than we did. It was easier than admitting what I actually did." "I know," I said again, and I meant it without cruelty. It usually is easier for people to rewrite the story so they're not the villain in it. "I lost everything that mattered," he said. "Vanessa, obviously. But more than that, I lost Lily's respect somewhere along the way without even noticing it was happening. And I lost whatever version of myself I could have been if I'd made different choices back then." I didn't try to comfort him. I don't think comfort was what he needed from me, and honestly, it wasn't mine to give anymore. Instead, I told him something I had come to understand slowly over the 10 years since I'd walked out of our kitchen with nothing but a suitcase and my daughter's hand in mine. What I took from you wasn't a marriage, Ethan. You'd already ended that yourself long before I ever packed a bag. What I took was the chance to keep pretending you were still the man you wanted people to believe you were. I gave you 10 years of silence to figure out who you actually were without me there to soften the answer. He nodded slowly, and something in his posture seemed to settle not into peace exactly, but into a kind of exhausted honesty I hadn't seen in him before, not even in the earliest years of our marriage. "Thank you," he finally said, "for not telling her everything when you could have." "I didn't do it for you," I said, standing to leave. "I did it for her. Everything I've ever done since the night I left has been for her." I left him sitting there with the letter still open on the table, and as I walked out into the late morning light, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication and not quite forgiveness either, but something closer to completion. The story I had carried alone for a decade finally had its second half spoken aloud, and I no longer needed to hold the rest of it in silence. Ethan sold the house 8 months after that conversation in the coffee shop. Lily told me about it in passing, mentioning that he'd finally decided the place was too large for one person, too full of rooms he no longer had any reason to walk into. I didn't ask why it had taken him 10 years to reach that conclusion. Some truths arrive on their own schedule, and I had learned a long time ago not to rush other people toward the ones they weren't yet ready to hold. He called Lily a few weeks into the process, asking if she wanted to come by before the movers finished clearing out the attic, in case there was anything of her childhood worth keeping. She went mostly out of a sense of practicality, and came back with a small cardboard box she later brought to my house, setting it on my kitchen table with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Dad found this," she said. "He wanted you to have it too." Inside were fragments of a life I remembered only in pieces. A handful of photographs from Lily's early childhood, a faded military coin from Colonel Hayes that Ethan had apparently kept without my knowledge, and folded at the bottom a piece of notebook paper in handwriting I recognized instantly as Lily's own, the careful, uneven letters of an 8-year-old still learning to trust a pencil. "I hope Daddy loves Mommy again." It read nothing more the kind of unguarded wish only a child could write down and mean completely. I sat with that piece of paper for a long time, after Lily left that evening, turning it over in my hands the way Ethan must have turned over my own letters so many times over the years. I thought about the little girl who had written it, who had wanted nothing more than for her family to stay whole, without any understanding yet of what her father had done to make that impossible. I felt no anger reading it, only a quiet, aching tenderness for the child I had once been so determined to protect from exactly this kind of heartbreak. I learned through Lily that Ethan had wept when he found the box alone in the attic, surrounded by the accumulated debris of the life he'd built, and then slowly dismantled through his own choices. I didn't ask for more detail than that, and I didn't need it. I understood in a way that required no further explanation that some part of him had finally arrived at the reckoning I'd been waiting a decade for him to reach, not the version where he explained himself out of guilt, but the quieter, more private kind where a person simply sits with everything they've lost and stops looking for someone else to blame for it. My own life in the months that followed continued in the rhythm I had built for myself over the past decade. Sunday dinners had become a fixture by then, a tradition Lily and Marcus and I had settled into without ever formally deciding to. Nothing elaborate, usually just a roast chicken, sometimes takeout when the week had been long, the four of us. And eventually, as the years went on, the beginnings of a grandchild's high chair pulled up to the table. I remember one particular Sunday evening not long after the box arrived, sitting on my back porch, while Lily set the table behind me through the kitchen window, the sound of her laughter carrying out into the yard, as Marcus teased her about something I couldn't quite make out. My granddaughter, not yet 2, was chasing a moth across the grass with the single-minded determination only very small children seem to possess, and I remember thinking, watching her, that this was the inheritance I had actually built. Not vengeance, not vindication. Just this, an ordinary evening full of people who loved each other without complication, entirely uninterrupted by the weight of a marriage that had ended so long ago it barely felt like my own story anymore. I have thought often in the years since about what people mean when they talk about revenge. I think most people imagine it as something loud, a public unraveling, a moment of humiliation delivered with precision, the satisfaction of watching someone else suffer the way you once suffered. I understand that impulse. I felt it myself in the earliest months after I discovered what Ethan had done, in the quiet hours when the anger hadn't yet settled into something more useful. But I came to believe slowly over the 10 years it took to build the life I now live, that revenge of that kind rarely satisfies the person seeking it. It keeps you tethered to the very person who hurt you, giving them one more piece of your attention, one more year of your energy long after they've stopped deserving either. Real revenge, I've come to understand, looks nothing like that at all. Real revenge is quieter. It is building a life so full, so peaceful, so entirely your own, that the person who once tried to diminish you is left standing outside of it, watching, understanding at last that they no longer belong anywhere inside the story. It is not about their suffering, it is about your completion. That evening, after Lily and her family had gone home, I went upstairs to the small cedar box I kept on my dresser, the one that had traveled with me through every posting, every move, every version of the life I built after that night in the kitchen. Inside, beneath a few photographs and an old set of dog tags, sat the wedding ring I had left behind on the counter a decade earlier, the one Ethan had eventually mailed back to me unprompted, along with a short note that simply read, "I think this belongs with the rest of your story, not mine." I turned it once between my fingers, feeling the weight of everything it represented, not just a marriage, but a version of myself I had once believed I needed a husband to complete. Then I closed the lid, set the box back on the dresser, and walked downstairs toward the porch light, where the sound of my family settling in for the evening was still faintly audible through the open window waiting for me to join them. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you tonight. Leave a comment below and tell me. There are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, so subscribe if you don't want to miss what comes next. Let's keep walking through these journeys together.